Yeah, so I'm gonna come at this from kind of a different perspective as the other talks, or from the other talks. I've been working on machine learning topics throughout my dissertation, which started about 4 years ago. So maybe a little less experience than some people, but I think this is an interesting topic. And even if you can apply these specific classifications, you might be able to find it useful in a topic that you're working on. So before I start on the background information, I just want to give everyone the link to the GitHub account that has the notebooks for this. And so that's that link at the very top. And I'll keep it up for a little bit while I talk. But this should all be completely self-contained. So I included some sample data, some CSVs, and otherwise. And we should be able to you should be able to run it as long as you have all the packages installed. And there isn't enough time to talk about a lot of the nitty-gritty details of this. I'll talk about as much as I can, but if you want to know more, there's a paper that I have in the reference list that talks more about this and specifically about how we validate it. And then I want to just have everyone's attention to the McGovern paper that's in BAMS. That's a really nice overview of machine learning and meteorology. And what I think I'm gonna talk about doing feature extraction. That's kind of very basic. But if you want to use storm identification and in tracking packages, you can actually extract features that way. So these are some that you can look at. If you have your favorite, you can probably use that one too. And if you're interested in mesoscale convective systems, there's some other topics out there that use machine learning. And a lot of the stuff I do is on spatial grids. So if you want to know more about that, there's a really nice book on getting to know more about that topic. So the reason I am using machine learning is I have my dissertation topic was focused on mesoscale convective systems. And you can see in the top left that there's kind of a nice combined view of what a mesoscale convective system looks like. On the surface, that kind of tilted plane is the radar depiction, and I'll show a lot of radar images, but in this color scheme, the intense precipitation is denoted by the reds and sometimes pinks, the moderate precipitation, the oranges and yellows, and the light precipitation in the green. So just remember that as we go forward. And these systems are deep moist convection, so it's very tall cloud. Sometimes is kind of tilted backwards. So if you can imagine that the MCS is moving to the right and it's tilted in the opposite direction of movement. So and if you look at these things as they're coming at you, this is actually from Northern Illinois University. They look like kind of like this big thing, this big shelf cloud that can go kind of from horizon to horizon in some cases. But the most important part about this picture is that you can go from almost no rainfall to this wall of rain and wind in a very short distance. And that ends up being kind of important for some machine learning applications. And these systems are important to look at because of their flooding potential. And there's also some issues with the forecast, how able we are to forecast these in the skill. So what do mesoscale convective systems look like? There's luckily a lot of literature out here. The Parker and Johnson paper is used very often. This is based on some of the early work that people just looking at radar data and trying to figure out the different subtypes of mesoscale convective systems. As we've moved forward, we've added subtypes, nonlinear types, and so these are all of kind of what mesoscale convective systems will look like, and the definition in Parker and Johnson's used is these are usually at least 100 kilometers long. And unfortunately, though, nature kind of throws you curveballs every once in a while, so you have the handsaw MCS and the squid MCS, so they're not always going to look exactly like that. But hopefully there are, and we found out there are some features that are common of all of these. And so a question I'll ask, I mean, would you consider these to be mesoscale convective systems? And I would say that most meteorologists would say no. You would say, okay, maybe a tropical system on the far left, a synoptic system in the middle, and maybe unorganized, maybe supercells or multicellular convection here, but probably not a mesoscale convective system. But for these, if you look at them, trailing stratiform is, most people will say that, okay, these are mesoscale convective systems. So there is some distinction between non-mesoscale convective systems and convective systems, but I'll show you that there ends up being a problem here. So the first problem is that we have a very large data set of radar images, and these are a NOWRAD data set about 2 kilometers, and for every 15-minute period have about 95 to 98% of those data available, so on the scale of 1 million images. And so if you're trying to go through and identify if there's a mesoscale convective system at this time period, it's going to take a really, really long time. So hopefully there's a better way to do that. And I'll just say that there are issues with these. So if you're interested in working with radar mosaics, definitely look into the literature of the issues with that. So that's one problem. There's a lot of data. The other problem is that, okay, there is a definition for mesoscale convective systems that you can use and you can apply using just basic image processing techniques. So find a cell that has sufficient, find a pixel that is represented or representative of moderate or intense precipitation, and if there's enough pixels and they're on a scale of 100 kilometers or greater, okay, that is a snapshot of a potential mesoscale convective system. And if those are kind of stacked in time for at least 3 hours, then that meets the basic definition of mesoscale convective system. But if you think about the other examples I showed, the hurricane, the synoptic system, depending on your segmentation approach, your unorganized convective cells can also meet that criteria. So we can use machine learning to add value to that definition, or that basic definition, that basic image processing step. So why I use that is if you run that segmentation, that image processing step, you get about 5.5 million of these snapshots. And I show a few of these on the right here. And so going through 5.5 million of these and classifying them as a certain type would take a really, really long time. So hopefully, and I'll show that you can use machine learning to actually differentiate between mesoscale convective systems and very common false positives. So I have four classes of false positives: tropical systems, synoptic systems, unorganized clusters, and then also ground clutter, surprisingly, can also be tripped by the segmentation procedure. So there is related work on this that's classifying rainfall clusters, and generally you say this, a researcher sits down and looks at radar data, maybe wind data or maybe mesocyclone data, and says that this is a supercell or this is a linear convective system, and they go through hundreds of those examples and you get a data set of these examples, and then you go through and extract the features out of it. So in this case, maybe the supercell has 9,000 square kilometer area, mean intensity of 35, etc., whereas the linear convective system has an area of 70,000, a mean intensity of 31 dBz, and so on and so forth. And so these studies looked at different types of convection and was pretty successful at classifying these. But I will say that no one has looked at the specifically MCS versus the other like tropical systems and that sort of thing. So there's some things that you want to ask yourself if you want to do a study similar to this, is that what are the actual types of classes? In some cases you don't actually know that. In my case, I was lucky that there is research out there that showed different subtypes of mesoscale convective systems, and we know what a tropical system looks like in radar images. We know what unorganized convection looks like in radar images. So that was nice. But if you don't know those classes, you might have to try a unsupervised approach, maybe self-organizing map or something like that. There has to be distinguishing features between the classes. If there isn't, there's no way to tell the difference. It's not magic. You have to actually be able to tell the difference. And you need to use the appropriate data. So if, for example, I wanted to use 500 millibar heights to determine if there is a supercell there or a tropical system there, that might not be the most appropriate. If you use that in conjunction with radar data, that might be useful. And then the algorithm. I know in a previous talk that the advice was to start simple and then work your way up until that doesn't work. So if you have performance that isn't meeting your standards, then you need to potentially find a more complicated algorithm. So then, like I said, you go through and find those examples. This is an MCS, this is a tropical system, this is supercell, et cetera, whatever your goals are for that. You need to have a way to extract the features, so usually area, intensity, and shape are things that people look at. And once you do that, you have your universal data set, and then you want to split it into training and testing data. And the point of this is you don't want to test the model that you generate on the same data that you used to generate it. That's kind of cheating. So you want that test data set to make sure that the model can generalize to other situations. So these are just some examples, and I simplified the radar colors. And so the dark colors are intense precipitation, the dark gray is moderate precipitation, the light gray is probably stratiform precipitation. And so these can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. Sometimes the light precipitation is leading, sometimes it's trailing, sometimes there's no light precipitation. And there's a lot of different shapes and sizes. And interestingly, if you follow the track of a mesoscale convective system, it can go through all of those different shapes and sizes in its own, in the single life cycle of an event. And these are just some examples of those false positives. As you can see, that if you have intense precipitation and moderate precipitation, you can actually, depending on your segmentation procedure, you can actually find areas that are larger than 100 kilometers. But you wouldn't consider those cases to be mesoscale convective systems. And so I will go to the notebooks. The first notebook we'll want to go to is the testing and training data. And just as a background of these data, they're binned by 5 dBz, so the raw data is going to be from 0 to 16. So just to do a conversion in your head, just times that value by 5. And what I show here is just some radar data from the super ratio event in May 2009. And if you're maybe thinking about generating a MCS classifier, for example, maybe you're not as interested in mesoscale convective systems as I am, but these might be some cases that you would want to include in that. So how would you actually do that? So if you don't have a storm tracking or identification package, you can actually literally go through in the raw data and circle these. So if you want to go into paint, you can just circle these with white lines, and the white is important because you want to be able to threshold a high value here, which is shown in the top right. And so essentially that's taking that geographic data and creating this circle here. And if you fill that in, you can actually use a labeling procedure to say this is a unique group, this is a different unique group. So it's identified by colors in this case. And then you can use those geographic data to actually filter out the original radar data and say, hey, I just want the locations where these 2 mesoscale convective systems are. Okay, so that's one way that you can do it. And so once you get to that point, these are just examples of features that you can use. Area, mean intensity, major axis length, those are all things that people have used to identify rainfall areas. So these are probably going to be useful for extracting those features and then the classification procedure. Like I said, these are some links to other. If you don't want to go that basic, you can also go to these tracking packages. So how I do this is I use region props, which is a function of scikit image, and it gives you a lot of basic properties of the kind of labeled the contiguous labeled region, and you can use those properties directly, or you can use those to derive features that you're interested in. So in the case of the super ratio, that we see that we have an area over 200,000 square kilometers, mean intensity around over 32 dBz. So all of these features that are associated with this would represent, say, one line in the NumPy array that you're going to pass to your machine learning algorithm. And then it's going to be associated with a label. In this case, the label is going to be mesoscale convective system. And then just as to simplify things for that, you give the label a numerical value. So this is how you translate that numerical value to an actual human readable thing. So 0 is MCS, 4 is clutter. So that's how you would translate that label. So I have the training data in that folder. It should be able to work. You should be able to read it in. You can look at the features, the columns, and see what their data types are. You can also look using pandas, grab a random sample and look at the features and see what their labels are. Then you do the same for the testing data. And they're going to be very similar. The only difference here is that the testing data are only from 2003 to 2005, whereas the training data are from 2006 to 2013. So then if you take the training data, you can actually use pandas to look at the various properties of these. So this is a good way to kind of sanity check. Are synaptic systems typically larger than mesoscale convective systems? I would say so. Are they larger than unorganized convection? I would say yes. So that's good. That makes sense. You can look at the mean intensity. Mesoscale convective systems are, in general, more intense than synaptic systems. So, okay, this is all looking good. And so then, just to simplify things, I just took two features, area, mean intensity, and passed those into a random forest classifier. So this is from scikit-learn. I think some people have mentioned before. And I just gave it 100 estimators in a random state of 42, just so we're all on the same page here. And so you want to pass the training data. So if you those two features, you just pass those two features and their values along with their label, so 0 through 4. And then what you can do to test, this is a very basic test of how well it's doing, is do the same but for the testing data. That random forest classifier that you use to predict on these data, pass these testing data into it, and that will give you an actual label. So this isn't a probability label, this is an actual label 0 through 4. And so that's your predicted label, and this is your expected label, and then you can just output these very basic metrics. And the one that people are probably familiar with is recall is probability of detection. So you can look at this. So at these different cases, and you can look at see how well it does for particular subtypes. In overall, we have an accuracy of 79%, and I don't actually show it here, but you can move around. You can use widgets to move around the area and mean intensity and see how that modifies your probabilistic output of a mesoscale convective system. And it's color coded, so the MCS samples are in red, the tropical are in blue, and so on. So you see that there are specific regions where these cases typically reside. So that's a good sign that they are actually able to be distinguished from one another. And this is a very simple model, so it's just area and mean intensity. So there's going to be some issues with that as well, but it's a good just basic example. So then if you go back to the training data and go down, if you use all the features, you get better accuracy. You get around 88%. And I'll say again, the accuracy isn't the best thing to do in this multiple class classification issue, especially if you have unbalanced data. So if you have more of one type, your accuracy might be a little inaccurate. But for just basic metrics, this is an okay demonstration. You can also look at the importance of the features. So in this case, it's saying when training the model, we see that intensity variance appears to be important to the classification. And we see that area, as we would expect, and mean intensity are also important things for the classification. And if you run the last line, you can output your own random forest classifier for these different types of rainfall regions. So then using that random forest classifier, we can then just mimic looking at data that has been extracted in some way, whether or not it's your own personal segmentation procedure, or if it's output from a storm tracking algorithm or a storm tracking package. You can, so this is an example of radar data from 1997. We use Pickle to read in the random forest classifier. And in this data, let's just mimic extracting the northern mesoscale convective system as we see here. So geographically, it's this guy. So we're zoomed in here. And you can see that it extracts the properties. This area is nearly 50,000 square kilometers. And based on that combination of features, the algorithm, the random forest algorithm gives it an 82% a label of MCS, or probability of an MCS label 82%. We zoom in on the southern one, we see a little higher probability of 90%. So just a small change in the features can put it into a different place in the feature space. But the problem is based on your segmentation approach. So these two MCS that I would say were mesoscale convective systems. If you zoom out too much and include too many pixels, you can actually move your, say, especially in this case, you can move the area too far into the synoptic part of the feature space. So you have to be very careful about what segmentation approach you use. So these are just other examples. Unorganized. Let's look at an example where we have an actual squall line. So in this case, they can be very large. So the 222 square kilometers is very similar to our synoptic, so-called synoptic region. And it still gives us a probability of MCS label of 93%. And part of that is likely due to the higher mean intensity. So these are all good signs. And then Katrina, based on its features, gives a tropical label probability of 94%. And then we also can rule out clutter here if we zoom into area in Texas. So that's just a very basic way of extracting data from radar data and then also just classifying things that you'll see in radar data. So the payoff from this that is interesting is that as you kind of turn up those probability thresholds, you can actually start to constrain your, say in this example, climatology and mesoscale convective systems closer to your manual observations. And in this case, my manual observations are just all of the slices that I circled. Where were they geographically and what was that occurrence rate? And that's on the left. And it's not labeled but just the darker colors are more of those events, the lighter colors are less. And we see on the right, this is output from the different probability thresholds. And another thing I'll say is make sure that your model is well calibrated so that these probability thresholds are actually meaningful. So if you say 95% probability, that actually means something. And I won't get into that, but that's in the paper. But so the no threshold is just saying if you just run the tracking on all of the cases that meet the segmentation process, where is that 40-hour isopleth? The fill is if you ratchet that up to a 0.5 threshold, a 0.5 probability of MCS threshold. So this is the basic threshold that people use for classification, either above 50 or less than 50. And if you get even higher into the 0.95 range, you can actually constrain this in the eastern and eastern plains in the Midwest. And so what's cool about this is this actually is getting closer and closer to what you actually see on the left, which is, I would say, the closest thing we have to ground truth in this case. And, okay, so that's the random forest, that's the tree-based stuff. And the stuff I've been working on for the last, I would say, half a year or more is identifying quasi-linear convective systems. And so these are interesting in a few ways. They could produce a lot of severe weather hazards. And one area of research on this is that they aren't very, the predictability of these isn't very good, or, well, in some cases isn't as great as people would want it to be. And so focusing on identifying events that are quasi-linear convective systems might be useful to improve our modeling capabilities. So if you look at the visual differences in quasi-linear convective systems and non-quasi-linear convective systems, typically it's this line of intense precipitation that you see. So it's not a straight line, but if you follow it, you can imagine that this is somewhat straight line here. And so it'll look different. The quasi-linear convective systems typically look like this, whereas the aerial or non-linear convective systems will look more like this. They just have more of an unorganized appearance on radar, and this is due to the dynamics that are happening within the system. So the first try, it obviously starts simple, is take 3,000 of these and say, yeah, this is a QLCS. No, this is not a QLCS. Take 3,000 of those, and I'll say that the cases that we chose were assigned an MCS probability of a probability of MCS label of 0.95 or higher, based on the aforementioned tree-based methods. And so, not surprisingly, the features associated with that are very similar. So if the non-QLCS events are in red, the QLCS events are in blue. And so you see that the features, in this case, area, mean, intensity, are very close. But if you recall back to the previous example of the tropical systems, unorganized, that they were kind of spread apart. So the accuracy on this was about 70 to 75%. And so that wasn't as good as I wanted, because if you have millions of those slices, that could add up very quickly. So the second try was to look at the literature. Obviously, convolutional neural networks have become very popular, and they're being picked up, obviously, in meteorology. And the inspiration for using those and the actual model architecture that I used was based on this Galaxy Zoo crowdsourcing project. And essentially what they did was they wanted to classify different types of galaxies. And I kind of thought, if you squinted, that the mesoscale convective systems kind of look like the different subtypes. You could say that the galaxy in the top right is more of a cellular type of mesoscale convective system, whereas maybe the top left is more of a tropical system that we don't want to include. And the one point at the last point is that it's much harder to generate data for these. And one of the issues with that is you have to have the same size, whereas when you were just doing feature extraction, what I was talking about before, you just took the stats from the segmented slice or the segmented snapshot, and that was your vector, and you had a bunch of those, and you passed it into your random forest. Whereas in this case, there are some decisions you have to make. What is important to you? Do you want to resize the image, including all of the pixel data? And that's the example here. Resize the image and have all the pixel data. And that might work, but I would say in meteorology we want to focus on the scale of these features, so we want the scale to be very similar for all of our cases. And so we could have squall lines, we could have very small bow echoes, and if we included all the pixels, our scale is just being thrown out. So the other point is you don't want to just grab random places in the squall line in this case. You want to actually focus on an area that would be important for classification. And just talking to the people that were doing the classification, including my own inner thoughts, is that this line of intense precipitation associated with these intense pixel values of maybe with associated stratiform precipitation, the lower pixel intensities, is something that would be important. And that's what we actually found that was an important thing. So this is an example of if we have a very large system versus a very small mesoscale convective system, what does the output look like? And So my approach, and maybe this isn't the best approach, but is to do that labeling procedure and all the pixel thresholds, all the pixels that are thresholded at 50 dBz, find the labels of those, measure the area, find the largest area, and then use that to actually as the representative of the single event. So that kind of preserves the scale, and it doesn't matter if you have a large squall line or if you have a small mesoscale convective system. So that box, I use about 256 by 256 kilometers. That box can then, that information is extracted, and that's what you would pass into your neural network, or your convolutional neural network. And one problem I found is that with only 3,000 samples, there was some issue, a potential issue with overfitting. You can use Keris's image data generator to actually slightly tweak the input image. And so if you had your original image on the left here, and you could do a rotation, I would say that we would still consider that to be a reasonable mesoscale convective system. But if you rotate it, if you flipped it, and it was completely upside down, that might not be something that you actually see in the data set. So you have to be careful in meteorological data to actually, when you do your data augmentation, actually have a reasonable sort of, in this case, rotation, or another thing you do is actually zoom in slightly to kind of let the scale that the convolutional neural network is really picking up on to be have a little more variability there. And so I just show these examples here where you zoom in on a cherry, it's still a cherry. If you flip the banana over, it's still banana. But that might not be true for meteorological cases. And so I'll just show some basic performance here. So I say random grid search, and really based on the computational power that I had you had to just change things based on the literature, and you really were kind of limited in how many times you could actually run this. So if I had to do it again, I would have a more structured grid search and be able to search way more hyperparameters. And the best performing one was 8 convolutional layers with 3 dense layers. And we see that the validation accuracy, you typically, after every iteration of the training, you see that the accuracy will change a little bit. Hopefully it's moving upwards. And this demonstrates at some point you get diminishing returns, and you need to stop the training because you start to overfit. And that's when you see your training accuracy starts to get better than your validation accuracy. So the interpretation of this, I need to go into this more, but I found some cool things, and this was talked about before, where the neural network is actually learning what kind of filters to use to find the best ways of gathering information out of the image. And what this is suggesting on the QLCS sample, which is the input image is this guy, is that it's picking up on these linear features in here. So like basically a line detector is that's the feature that's being extracted out of at least this layer. Whereas the non-linear sample, you don't actually see that feature in there. So that's going to downstream. That's going to influence the output, probably the classification from the output. And so after you run all that and you have these samples that you didn't use for training, and you assign them a probability of a QLCS label, I just took some random samples and actually showed that the results are encouraging, because if you have a QLCS probability of less than 0.05, see that you have more cellular types of cases, not a lot of lines, maybe slightly smaller, but just based on the actual summary statistics of that, they shouldn't be too much smaller. But on the right, the QLCS, if you say, I only want events that were assigned a 0.95 or higher QLCS probability, you actually see the linear features in here. So that was pretty encouraging. So I have a notebook, but I wasn't able to figure out how to make it not break everyone's computer in here. So I didn't actually, if you're interested in actually using the model that I generated, you can. I think it's a very large file, but so what you do if you had that model, you would do this. You'd use this load model function, and would assign it to this variable. So just imagine that you actually did that, and so what I wanted to do was actually make this to be not dependent on segmentation. There's some issues with that that you might want to you might not want to deal with. So what if we just focused on intense regions of rainfall within the entire radar image, and based our classifications on that 256 by 256 kilometer box. And this pre-processing step does that, extracts that information out for you. You pass it the entire radar image, and it will label the contiguous regions that are above 50 dBz or higher, and it will put a box around those and actually pass those into your model. And there's some normalization that is going on here to make things work with the model. And just a simple case, a simple application of this is if you have the minimum probability of 0.5, minimum probability of a QLCS label of 0.5, add that actual region to your output, your resulting image, and then see what it looks like. So for the superderatio case, we see here that you just read in the image, you say anything below a stratiform, anything below 20 dBz, just get rid of it. Usually there's a lot of noise in there that you don't want to deal with. And then you pass it into that pre-processing step in the classification step. And just for visualization purposes, I actually do a dilation on this just to make it easier to see. And then if you plot that, what was really interesting here is that you actually get you don't have to do any segmentation, just know that there's certain pixels that you want to focus, certain pixel intensities you want to focus on. And you see here that it's actually identifying the linear features within the radar data. So that was pretty interesting. And maybe the superderatio event is a crazy event. Let's just find a regular squall line. So so all of these 50 dBz areas around here were located in areas that the model was giving a 0.5 or higher probability of QLCS classification. And then you can also look at the evolution in these mixed mode cases. So on April 27th, 2011, there was a couple passages of quasi-linear convective systems. And so we see here these are identified. The kind of cellular, maybe linear things are not identified. This doesn't connect, which is kind of an interesting case. I think has something to do with the not very good gradient here. So that could be an issue with the model that needs to be further looked into. Then you see another QLCS here. You pretty much ignore the cellular events, the cellular sorts of modes here that not be considered QLCSs. And then as you get further into the events, you notice that it just completely ignores the supercells. Even though it has those very high intensity pixels, it's not giving them a high probability of a QLCS label. So that's encouraging, and I think this is kind of an interesting approach that maybe even if you're not using, if you don't care about mesoscale convective systems or QLCS, it could be something that you could apply to your own research. And so then the payoff on that is that if you run that classification in all of your snapshots and then use some tracking and create a climatology of events that you'd consider QLCSs based on your probability threshold. For June, July, and August, you see a very nice maximum. So the yellow colors are representing a maximum, whereas the lighter blues and the purples are lesser counts. So this is just the counts of occurrences. And then what's kind of very interesting is if you look at June through August, what is the percent for each, so in this case it's a 40 by 40 kilometer grid, what is the percent of cases, of MCS cases that are actually quasi-linear convective systems based on that model? And you see that you have very high values in the Midwest in June through August, where lesser values near the coast, which is kind of what you would expect here. You do have MCS events that you would consider to be MCS, but maybe aerial and more in the southeast United States, whereas in the Midwest United States, you have more quasi-linear events. So that's all that. All of those are pointing to that this is a somewhat promising approach. So these are my references. Can't see them. Maybe if you download the PowerPoint, you could copy and paste. And I'll take questions now. Thank you.
Alex? So Alex, obviously I have some knowledge of this project, but can you talk a little bit about how we also brought, I know there's some hesitancy, I think, by some folks, especially in the Met community, to kind of let this all go, unsupervised. Can you talk about how we brought the human into the process, using a researcher to say with his or her own eyes that, yes, this is indeed what we believe is an MCS, which may have differing opinion depending on what researcher looks at it, but then using that to help train the neural network?
I mean, yeah, it was a multi-year process of literally going through multiple summers of radar data, or radar images and sequences of that, and saying, where do we notice MCS events occurring, where do we not, or where are there cases where we shouldn't expect MCS events, and using that, we were able to say that the output from the algorithms was reasonable in that sense. And I mean, the classification process was multiple months of going through the data and actually hand labeling things. And in the case of the quasi-linear convective systems, where you're starting to get into subtypes of mesoscale convective systems, which can be very contentious, people are not always going to agree on that. We had multiple people label the same data, and surprisingly, there was a lot of agreement, but there were cases where we didn't agree. So there was a lot of the human aspect that was put into this.
Yeah, so thinking about that and thinking about going through all of that, and blessings on you for doing that and involving other people in that. But that's kind of where my question lies. I mean, I think there's a lot of pent-up knowledge within our community regarding a lot of these things, not only things like QLCSs, but classifying things like tropical cyclones from satellite data, or mid-latitude cyclones, for example. There's a great aspect of the human element, but how do we capture that so that we could then use it in this to then help the classification process, so that we're not relying on just going unclassified and kind of having it come up, although there would be usefulness in doing that alongside this human element of almost, truly, I'm trying to think of the right terminology here, but putting it up somewhere that literally you can have thousands of meteorologists all over the country, like QLCS, not QLCS.
Right.
Our idea was to do that, get that done at a conference, like literally set some, you want to participate in a project, come and identify 100 radar images, and multiply that out, right, using basically open crowdsource.
Crowdsourcing. That was the term I was going for. Late the day on Tuesday.
Yeah, you can do that. You just have to worry about the non-expert aspect of that. So
the way I would think about it is that we could use something like that to just generate the initial data, see where there's congruence. Okay, that's pretty easy. Ready to go. 95% congruence. We'll go with it. And then you have some sort of expert team. That's the research team comes together then to the debate. The ones that are kind of on the border or something like that, or decide how deep you go down into any subclass types that, could then be all cobbled together, put up on the cloud, for instance, so that anybody could use it. I just think that would be just a quite useful thing that could really involve all levels of meteorological expertise. Because even, juniors and seniors in an undergraduate could be seeing things because they're looking at things for the first time that somebody with 30 years of experience is ignoring just because of experience in some ways, and that could just be a really interesting aspect of our science going forward.
And I will say that the other way that this probabilistic classification thing, where if you have this threshold of what kind of event you want to look at, you can actually go into the data set and say, I want things that are definitely QLCS because that's my interest, and so you can gather a handful of events, and that will help you actually focus your research on particular events. Because sometimes it's like you're just going through piles and piles of data and trying to find events that you actually care about. And so that it could be a good annotation sort of approach.
And Ryan?
I want to add on to Kevin's comment. I think a crowdsourcing of say either radar imagery or satellite imagery, label this thing in the radar image or satellite image would be a really cool thing for Unidata to work with the university community on. Because on the AI side, like one of the things we'd like to have are more benchmark type data sets, and especially for this labeling problem, you need hand labels in a lot of cases, and that's very labor intensive. So I mean, if you get every single professor who teaches a synoptic class and have some interface where they get all their students, have them go through some images and label, is this, so I think for this it'd be better not go beyond just QLCS or not QLCS, but like come up with a set of things we want to find in weather data, and whether it be Go16 or MRMS or one of these other big data sets. Yeah, like go crazy, pick like 50 different things or something like that, and is one of these things in the image. And you could really train, I think, some really good machine learning models and get a lot out of that. And then it'd also be a good community benchmark to be able to try different methods on. So yeah, I think I'd be interested in talking about that with people further.
The Galaxy Zoo would be a nice template
Yeah,
for that.
yeah,
And there's
Zoo.
also, I think there's also a hurricane
The
crowdsourcing.
one, and there's an overshooting tops one. So Chris Bedker has actually taken some of the previous generation GOES data and looked at it for overshooting tops, like identify where the overshooting top is. There's actually a crowdsourced platform which you put up there, and there are thousands of, it wouldn't be specific meteorologists, but thousands of individuals actually look at these. So, yep, this is the point with the lowest temperature on it, based on the label I have here, and they go through and then they use that as the training data.
Huh.
Actually probably outperform that to some extent, but I think
I don't see any reason not. I mean, citizen science is being used in many other fields, medical fields, identification of flora, fauna. I mean, it's all over the place. Why aren't we leveraging it more? It'd be great. It'd be great. Ryan, question?
Nice talk. Do you think you can use?
No.
The answer is no.
I think I can use the microphone. No. Do you think you can use the machine learning model on forecast data set? So one of the big problems is trying to objectively identify, say, an MCS in a forecast.
Great show, right?
Yeah, and there's a lot of benefits that could come from that if you can do that. Not only could you create forecast guidance that basically tells you what the forecast convective mode is, but you could also go through a lot of forecasts and say, oh, I just want to pick out the events where QLCS occurred in the forecast, and then go back and retrieve those and run some statistics on those events and skill scores and such.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great approach to that, and I think that's worthwhile to look at. And not only that, the QLCS, non-QLCS, but potentially subset or subtypes of that. And this is actually composite reflectivity from WRF. And so there are some issues about modifying the scale. So like if you trained it on 2 kilometer data and all of a sudden you're applying it to 4 kilometer data, you need to modify it a little bit and be careful about that sort of thing. And but we have looked at applying that to model data, not specifically like operational model kind of stuff, but that's definitely something that I think would be good to look at.
I started my whole career doing, I guess, the imperative version of morphometrics, which is sort of what you're doing here, measuring, blobs.
Yeah.
You know, are they, you know, contiguity of pixels exceeding thresholds and
Yeah.
roundness and yada yada, right? So, so then the results are always exactly as interesting as the kind of arbitrary, you know, piles of parameters it takes to say a thing, you know, fits a label. But at least you knew exactly what it was, right? You write a paper and you say, well, the objects I call in MCS are greater than this dimension in, you know, no square root of the areas, whatever it is, right? But here you end up with a thing that's, is it better? And is it objective? And, you know, what's better about it than the tedious old morphometrics, which at least were explicit?
So when you say tedious, are you talking about manual?
No, I mean the algorithmic, remotely 10-parameter algorithm.
Oh.
That finds, you know, square, you know, 10-shape criteria or whatever.
I mean so the first thing is that just the basic definition of MCS, you could apply that to any X meteorological phenomena. You know, to find this in a grid, you have to say it's X. You know, whatever. That basic thing, we know that that's probably not good enough for this case, but it could be good enough, depending on your event. And beyond that, even events that are given the basic machine learning treatment, say like, well, I guess rain and forest tree-based treatment, there are some cases where I wish there was a really cool animation where you change around the data points and it's the same mean. You can move around the orientation of the actual cluster where the pixels are. They could still have the same features, but to a person looking at it, it's distinguishable. And that's kind of what we found in this, that the non-linear systems, even though they had the same or very similar basic features to them, if you looked at them as a person, as someone, you know, saying, yeah, they were actually distinguishable. And so I think that's what's really cool about the convolutional neural network, is you're incorporating some of that visual distinction power, I guess, into the something that's repeatable. And I would probably say that it's not going to be, it's not better than a person. Obviously, it's less. You have an accuracy of less than 100%, but it, you know, is it 3 a.m. and the person's tired? That maybe they aren't as good at classification at that point as another point. Maybe they change their mind. I know there were a few cases where I had to restart because my definition of MCS got changed a little bit, but there's a lot of that subjectivity that maybe if you can live with it, sure, but if you want to be more objective about the classifications, you can go in a different direction. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It was very interesting to see how the visual features were able to be used to distinguish between the two cases, whereas the just basic stats were not able to do that.
Apparently less cruel to graduate students, for example.
That's been morphometrics, imperative morphometrics.
Yeah. After you've got done manually labeling case 3000 at 2 in the morning, it gets kind of old.
All right, let's thank Alex one more time.